Good morning. First of all, I'd just like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of the land that we're meeting on today. And I really want to thank you for your playing before the didgeridoo. I was very moved by that. Thank you very much, I really felt the presence here. So thank you. My name is Louise Allwood. Many of you here would know me from my many years spent over at North Queensland Land Council. Earlier this year I made the big move over to Darwin, and now I'm at the Northern Land Council. So just a bit of an introduction so that people realise that I'm no longer in Queensland, I'm now in the Northern Territory. So today I'll be speaking about the 2020 jury decision made by Justices Mortimer, White and Colvin. Here the full Federal Court were asked to consider two questions in relation to overlapping consent determinations of native title, which recognised the non-exclusive native title rights and interests held by two groups over the same area. We should move this along. More specifically, the questions related to whether the court has the power under the Native Title Act to determine the allocation of one or more PBCs. I will discuss the anthropological impacts associated with one of these questions. And just to give context to this, the jury decision relates to actually Amy's and her colleagues' Waimak's rep body area. So they will be the ones that will be able to answer more of the questions in relation to what that jury decision's about. I won't be going into much about that, but just some case studies that I've experienced as a result. So, the first question. It was whether in an instance where the court has determined that there are distinct groups of persons, each of which hold common rights comprising native title over the same area of land, whether the court has the power when making a determination of native title under the Native Title Act to determine that more than one PBC is to perform the functions given to PBCs under the Native Title Act and the Native Title Prescribed Body Corporate's regulations. That's the exact wording there. And the answer is yes, but only where, as in this case, there has been an overall determination of the existence of separate and distinct native titles over the same land. The anthropological issue relates to the reference of distinct groups of persons who hold separate and distinct native titles over the same land. I'll now present two case studies that have been impacted by the case law set by the 2020 jury decision. Both case studies relate to overlapping assertions of native title, where the ethnography did not support the jury premise of the distinct groups of persons who hold separate and distinct native titles over the same land. Instead, in both cases, the ethnography evidenced a deep-rooted interconnectedness between the neighbouring groups. This subsequently had impacts on how the neighbouring groups were able to structure their PBCs, as they did not fall into the category of being distinct and separate. Yet each group desired to use their own existing PBCs to perform their functions. Case study 1 relates to two successful determined native title holding groups who have been described as holding native title at the language group level. Here, both native title holding groups assert rights over an area of country located between each of their existing determination areas. I will refer to this area as the research area and the language groups as groups A and B. I'll first speak about social organisation. Classically, both language groups A and B participated within the same regional system of social organisation. This system ascribed to named and unnamed patrilineal moieties that have been associated with patriclan totems and with their corresponding four named sections. Ascribing to the same system enabled members of both language groups A and B to intermarry. This is attested within the genealogies of both groups, which indicate they have been intermarrying for multiple generations. This is despite the contemporary adaptations to this system. My usual progression now would be to speak about local organisation, but I'm going to come back to this shortly. and speak first about linguistics. 3 linguists have illustrated on maps the geographical extent of groups A and B's language. Although I note that these maps are to do with the distribution of language emplacement on country and do not define absolute boundaries in relation to land tenure, nevertheless these linguistic maps are helpful as they illustrate the extent of the language-affiliated countries of both groups. Here, all 3 linguists indicated that the languages of groups A and B intersect within the research area. Further, one of the linguists had identified a close lexical relationship between groups A and B in that they shared 46% of their vocabulary. Additionally, one of the linguists claimed that a tribe cannot be defined on linguistic criteria, as other factors such as social organisation are relevant to coming to an understanding of the socio-political extent of the tribe, in that systems of social organisation are not confined to the limits of language groups. This being relevant to our presentation as it speaks to the interconnectedness of those language groups. Methodology. There are a number of dreaming stories associated with the research area. One in particular is quite significant as it depicts an intersection zone or a handover area between groups A and B and between another third neighbouring language group. In the story, each of the 3 language groups are represented by animals who, within the story, speak their own language, with the story itself relating to a particular sacred site that has regional interconnectedness and significance to each language group. As we understand, ancestral created beings emplaced language and the law into the landscape during the dreaming, thereby creating an inseparable relationship between the land, law, and language. In this way, the mythological story is not only depicting the intersection of 3 language-affiliated countries, but is also setting the stage for social complementarity between the 3 named language groups. Now back to local organisation. Both groups A and B were classically linked within a regional system of local organisation, where traditional land tenure was associated with local estates, the membership to which was based on the principle of patrilineal descent. Contemporarily, through processes of coalescence and succession, the system of land tenure for both groups has adapted from the patriclan estate model to one that encompasses the whole language group and has shifted from the principle of patrilineal descent to cognatic descent. Significant to this discourse is the relationship between the language groups. More specifically, this relates to the intersection of the former patriclan estates, which reside on the borders of their language-affiliated country. Despite the fact that these patriclan estates no longer or are limitedly acknowledged, despite the fact that these patriclan estates are no longer or limitedly acknowledged, the underlying socio-political relationships with their neighbours still exist across the so-called language group divide. In this regard, Sutton claims that estates at the peripheries of linguistic territories may carry 2 or even 3 linguistic identities, and their owners will normally identify with each language variety so named. In a similar vein, Elkin explains that a tribe usually consists of several localised groups, which are the real political and economic units, and it is they which tend to make one tribe dovetail, as it were, into its neighbours. Indeed, language apart, border hordes of 2 tribes are more interested in one another than are distant hordes within one tribe. And according to Radcliffe Brown, in some instances at least, the boundary between one tribe and another may be indeterminate, with hordes lying on the boundary of tribes, sometimes being described as half-half. That is, not properly belonging to either of the 2 tribes. Now, returning back to the research area, the ethnography indicates that at least a portion of the research area was interspersed with discontiguous patriclan estates that were associated with both groups A and B. Contemporarily, through a process of conjoint succession, the land tenure within this area has adapted from the discontiguous patriclan estates to both language groups A and B having both succeeded to the whole area, creating what can be referred to as an intersectional zone. In this way, this adaptation is rooted in the classical past. This is further substantiated by 4 now deceased senior decision makers who many years ago indicated that the countries of groups A and B were mixed in the research area, and was described to me by another decision maker as being shared, where we merged together, in this way illustrating Elkin's dovetail. Here I have demonstrated that groups A and B are inseparably interconnected by their traditional law and custom.
How much time have you allowed for each other?
15 minutes.
Okay.
Case study 2. Julie will be pleased to know that I will briefly discuss this one, as in many ways it's very similar to the first case study. Case study 2 relates to a native title claim over a pastoral lease. Here, 2 estates which belong to different language groups have been identified as identified as holding native title rights and interests in the area. Primarily, each estate is traditionally associated with separate parts of the pastoral lease, except for a portion where the 2 estates intersect. I'll refer to the intersectional zone as the shared area and the estate groups as groups A and B. Here I'll speak about social and local organisation together. The 2 language groups associated with estate groups A and B participate within the same regional system of social and local organisation, which enables them to intermarry and to dovetail their land tenure together. In this case study, social organisation is based on 8 named subsections, 4 named sections and 2 unnamed patrimonies. This social structure is associated with 4 lines of descent, through father's father, mother's father, father's mother and mother's mother, each category holding different but complementary responsibilities in land. With local organisation being identified through father's father, who are the owners of the estate, and are complemented by the managers of their estate, who are identified through mother's father. In this way, land tenure is associated with patriclan estates and supported by persons in the social category of mother's father, and who hold important ceremonial and social duties in relation to these patriclan estates. In line with these traditional practices, both groups A and B have contemporarily undergone a simple adaptation from patrilineal to cognatic descent, thereby acknowledging the owner and manager roles within their native title determinations. As shown here, both groups A and B are intertwined within a system of social and local organisation. I won't speak about linguistics in this case study, and I'll move on to mythology. There are 3 significant dreaming tracks within the claim area, one of which traverses the shared area. In this region, estates are described as the land surrounding constellation of sites. Sometimes some of these sites overlap with the dreaming of another estate, making it difficult to determine estate boundaries. Additionally, sites can be associated with 2 or more dreamings of different section classification. These sites and surrounding countries are considered shared by more than one estate. As such, it's not surprising that groups A and B have a shared area, given that there are 3 significant dreaming tracks in a relatively small area. To conclude, as I've demonstrated within case studies 1 and 2, both sets of language groups are linked within regional systems of traditional law and custom associated with their social and local organisation, which enables them to intermarry and therefore dovetail their land tenure into their neighbours, despite their association with different language name groups. Further, their mythology and, as presented in case study 1, their linguistics, indicate a transitional intersection that merges their linguistical, cultural and physical landscapes. As such, these case studies evidence the anthropological issue associated with the premise stated in the 2020 Drury decision of distinct groups of persons who hold separate and distinct native titles over the same land. Instead, in both cases, the ethnography painted a completely different picture of an inseparable interconnectedness stemming from the dreaming, when the language and the law were imbued into the land. Yet, in both case studies, each of the 4 groups intended to use their existing PBCs to perform their native title functions. But significantly, they did not meet the necessary requirements established by the jury decision.